The Friday night crowd at Sullivan's Tavern was packed with the usual mix of college students and young professionals when 79-year-old Frank O'Malley made his way slowly through the front door. His WWII Navy veteran cap sat proudly on his gray head, and his worn but clean peacoat told the story of a man who had served his country with honor 78 years earlier. Bartender Rick Davies took one look at the elderly customer approaching his bar and immediately made assumptions about his ability to pay and his right to be there. "Hold up there, old-timer," Davies called out loudly, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowded tavern. "I need to see proof that you can pay for drinks before I serve you. We've had problems with people ordering drinks they can't afford." Frank paused, genuinely confused by the hostile reception. In decades of occasionally stopping by bars after VA appointments, no one had ever questioned his ability to pay before ordering. "Son, I just wanted to order a beer and watch the game," he said quietly, his voice carrying the patient dignity of someone who had survived naval combat in the Pacific Theater. Davies' response was swift and public. "That's what they all say. Look, this isn't a charity bar for senior citizens. If you can't prove you have money, you need to leave before you embarrass yourself." The words echoed across the tavern, causing conversations to stop and patrons to turn in their seats. Frank felt every eye in the place focus on him, transforming what should have been a simple drink into a public spectacle of humiliation. What Davies didn't know, what his assumptions and prejudices blinded him to, was that 6 young men in civilian clothes had been playing pool in the back corner when the confrontation began. They weren't college students or young professionals despite their casual appearance. They were United States Navy SEALs on shore leave, and they had just witnessed something that demanded immediate correction. The moment Davies questioned Frank's dignity, something shifted in the air around the tavern. These 6 SEALs understood something Davies was about to learn. When you disrespect a Navy veteran, you disrespect the entire Navy. Sullivan's Tavern had been a fixture in downtown San Diego for over 30 years, serving drinks to sailors from nearby Naval Base San Diego and civilians alike. The bar was located just 4 blocks from the harbor, making it a popular spot for both active-duty Navy personnel and veterans who wanted to stay connected to their naval roots. The walls were decorated with maritime memorabilia, old Navy photographs, and ship wheels, creating an atmosphere that celebrated San Diego's deep connection to naval history. Ironically, the very establishment that honored naval tradition with its decor was about to witness one of its employees completely disrespect a World War II Navy hero. Frank O'Malley had been coming to Sullivan's occasionally for the past 10 years, ever since his wife Catherine passed away from cancer after 52 years of marriage. The monthly visits usually coincided with his VA medical appointments, providing him with a brief connection to the naval community he'd left behind decades earlier. At 79, Frank lived alone in a small apartment near Balboa Park, surviving on his Navy pension and Social Security, while managing the lingering effects of injuries received during World War II. The loneliness had been particularly difficult since Catherine's death, and these occasional visits to Sullivan's represented one of his few remaining connections to the outside world. His journey to this moment had begun 78 years earlier, when 18-year-old seaman Frank O'Malley reported aboard the USS Enterprise in Pearl Harbor, just months after the devastating attack that had pulled America into the war. Frank had served throughout the Pacific Campaign, participating in battles at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, shrapnel from a Japanese dive bomber had torn through his left shoulder, earning him a Purple Heart and 2 months of recovery in a Navy hospital before returning to his ship. The Enterprise had been one of the most decorated ships in Navy history, and Frank had been proud to serve aboard her during some of the most crucial battles of the Pacific War. The memories of those battles still visited him in quiet moments: the sound of incoming enemy aircraft, the faces of shipmates who never made it home, and the weight of survival when so many others had fallen. Rick Davies had been the head bartender at Sullivan's for 5 years, working his way up from server to manager through what he considered sharp business instincts and a keen eye for profitable customers. At 32, Davies had developed strong opinions about the kind of clientele that helped his bar succeed: young professionals with disposable income, sailors with monthly paychecks, and college students who ordered expensive drinks and tipped well. In his view, elderly customers were generally bad for business, ordering cheap drinks, nursing them for hours, and leaving minimal tips while taking up valuable bar space during peak hours. The irony was thick. Davies worked in a bar that celebrated naval history, surrounded by photographs of World War II sailors and Pacific War memorabilia, yet he'd never taken the time to understand what those images represented. To him, the naval decorations were just part of the bar's theme, no different from the nautical rope and anchor decorations that adorned other waterfront establishments he'd worked in. He'd never served in the military himself, had no family members in the service, and viewed the military memorabilia as marketing tools rather than tributes to real sacrifice and service. This Friday evening had been particularly busy, with the bar near capacity and every table occupied. Davies was focused on maximizing revenue from the crowd, tracking drink orders, and calculating potential tips with the precision of someone whose income depended on volume and turnover. When he saw Frank enter the tavern, something about the elderly man's appearance triggered all his assumptions about unprofitable customers. Frank's peacoat was clean but obviously old, his shoes were worn but polished, and he moved with the careful steps of someone dealing with age-related mobility issues. In Davies' stressed mindset, Frank looked like exactly the kind of customer who would complicate his already challenging shift and reduce his overall earnings for the evening. "I need to see proof that you can pay for drinks," Davies announced as Frank approached the bar, his voice loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. The request was unprecedented in Frank's experience, but he reached for his wallet calmly. "Is there a particular reason you're asking me for payment in advance?" Frank inquired, his tone respectful but puzzled. Davies' response was dismissive and public. "Let's just say I can usually tell who's good for it and who isn't. This is a business, not a senior center. We need customers who actually spend money." The confrontation was drawing attention from other patrons. Several people had hauled out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Frank felt the familiar weight of public scrutiny, the same feeling he'd experienced in previous encounters where his age and modest appearance had led to assumptions about his character or worth. "Son, I understand you're running a business," Frank said, his voice maintaining the steady tone that had served him well during naval service, "but I've been coming here for 10 years, and I've never had any problems paying for my drinks." Davies' laugh was harsh and carried across the tavern. "10 years? Right. And I suppose you tip well too. Look, old man, I've seen this before. You order the cheapest beer on tap, nurse it for 3 hours, ask for free peanuts, and leave a $1 tip if we're lucky. That's not the kind of customer we want on a busy Friday night." The accusations were not only hurtful but completely false. Frank had always ordered regular-priced drinks, never lingered inappropriately, and always left a 20% tip despite living on a fixed income. But Davies' assumptions had painted him as a stereotypical problematic elderly customer, and he was determined to prevent what he saw as an inevitable drain on his profits. But 6 men at the pool table in the back corner had stopped their game to listen to the exchange, and their patience was reaching its limit. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, the senior SEAL in the group, was the first to recognize what was happening. At 31, Rodriguez had completed 6 deployments and earned his rank through leadership in some of the Navy's most challenging operations. He'd seen too many veterans struggle with civilian life after their service, and he'd made it his mission to ensure that those who had served before him received the respect they'd earned. The other SEALs around the pool table represented the elite of naval special operations. Petty Officer First Class David Thompson, a 29-year-old from Texas, had been a SEAL for 9 years and had deep respect for the veterans who had paved the way for his generation. Petty Officer First Class James Wilson, a 28-year-old from Detroit, was already reaching for his phone to document what was happening, understanding the power of social media to expose injustice. Petty Officer Second Class Carlos Martinez, a 26-year-old from California, was preparing to intervene, his sense of justice outweighing any concern about causing a scene. Petty Officer Second Class Kevin Chen, a 25-year-old from Washington State, was watching with growing anger as an elderly Navy veteran was being treated like an unwanted burden. Petty Officer Third Class Robert Washington, a 23-year-old from Georgia and the youngest of the group, was learning a valuable lesson about standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. These 6 SEALs had been enjoying a rare evening off together, celebrating Chen's recent promotion and sharing stories from their various deployments. They'd chosen Sullivan specifically because of its naval history and military-friendly reputation, and they'd been enjoying the familiar atmosphere of a place that understood and respected naval service. Watching an elderly Navy veteran being humiliated in a bar that claimed to honor naval tradition was more than they could tolerate. "You seeing this?" Rodriguez whispered to Thompson, who was lining up a shot on the 8-ball. "That's a Navy veteran getting disrespected by someone who's never served a day in his life," Thompson replied, his jaw tightening as he watched Davies continue to humiliate Frank in front of dozens of witnesses. "This is completely unacceptable," Martinez added, setting down his pool cue. "That man served his country with honor, and this bartender is treating him like garbage." Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. The bonds of naval brotherhood didn't recognize age, rank, or era of service. When one sailor was disrespected, they were all disrespected. When someone's naval service was mocked or dismissed, it was an attack on everyone who had ever worn the uniform. Meanwhile, at the bar, Davies was escalating the situation further. "Look, I'm trying to be nice here, but you need to understand reality. This isn't some VFW hall where you can sit around all night telling war stories. We have a young crowd that wants to have fun, and frankly, your presence brings down the energy." Frank reached slowly into his wallet, pulling out 4 $20 bills, more than enough to cover several drinks and a generous tip. "Would this be sufficient proof that I can pay for a beer?" Davies glanced at the money dismissively. "Anyone can flash some cash. The question is whether you'll actually spend it on drinks or just order one beer and make it last all night like most people your age." The insult was the final straw for Rodriguez. Navy values weren't just words to him, they were principles that included respect for those who had served before. When a Navy veteran was being disrespected, it was every active duty sailor's responsibility to act. "Excuse me," Rodriguez said, approaching the bar with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with this gentleman." Davies looked over, annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please return to your game." Rodriguez smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Actually, it does concern me. You see, I'm a chief petty officer in the United States Navy SEALs, and so are my 5 teammates over there. We've been listening to you disrespect a fellow sailor, and we're not going to stand for it." As if responding to a silent command, the other 5 SEALs approached the bar and formed a semicircle around the confrontation. They didn't make any threatening gestures, but their coordinated movement and obvious military bearing immediately changed the atmosphere in the tavern. Davies' confidence began to waver as he found himself facing 6 of the most highly trained warriors in the American military. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm just running my business. This man doesn't fit the demographic we're trying to attract. I'm Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, United States Navy SEALs," Rodriguez replied, pulling out his military ID. "These are my teammates. We're stationed at Naval Base Coronado, and we've been watching you humiliate a Navy veteran who deserves much better treatment." Thompson stepped forward. "Petty Officer First Class David Thompson, SEAL Team 5. I'd like to take a look at this gentleman's naval service record, because I think you might be surprised by what you find." Frank looked up at the young SEALs surrounding him, his eyes filling with tears of gratitude. In his 79 years, he'd rarely experienced such immediate and unconditional support from strangers. "Sir, what's your name and service history?" Rodriguez asked respectively. "Frank O'Malley, retired," Frank replied, his voice stronger now. "I served aboard the USS Enterprise during World War II. "What battles did you participate in, sir?" Wilson asked, his tone reverent. "Midway, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea," Frank said quietly. "Lost a lot of good sailors in those fights, but we did our job and helped win the war." The words hit the SEALs like a physical force. The USS Enterprise was legendary in Navy history, and anyone who had served aboard her during World War II was automatically a hero. The battles Frank mentioned were among the most crucial naval engagements in American history. "Sir, would you be willing to show us your service records?" Rodriguez asked, though the reverence in his voice made it clear he already believed every word. Frank nodded and carefully reached into his wallet, pulling out a worn leather folder that contained his military documents. He opened it slowly, revealing his discharge papers, Purple Heart citation, and several battle ribbons. Rodriguez took the documents with the same reverence he would show to sacred texts. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the now silent tavern, "this is Navy veteran Frank O'Malley. He served aboard the USS Enterprise during World War II, participating in some of the most crucial naval battles in our nation's history. He earned a Purple Heart for wounds received in action against the Japanese Navy." The tavern erupted. Every conversation stopped as patrons absorbed what they were hearing. Several people began applauding, and others were openly wiping away tears. The 6 SEALs snapped to attention and rendered a perfect naval salute to Frank, who slowly stood and returned it with the precision that 78 years hadn't erased. "This man," Rodriguez continued, "helped save our country during World War II. He risked his life in the Pacific Theater, fighting battles that determined the outcome of the war. He is a hero, and he deserves to be treated as such." Martinez pulled out his phone and began scrolling through naval databases. Frank O'Malley, USS Enterprise, World War II veteran, Purple Heart, Pacific Theater ribbons, battle stars for Midway and Philippine Sea. This man is a verified American hero. Davies stood frozen, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. He had just humiliated one of America's greatest generation, a sailor who had risked his life for his country when Davies wasn't even born. But the SEALs weren't finished with their lesson. Chen turned to address the entire tavern. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what a real American hero looks like. Someone who answered his country's call when he was barely 18 years old and fought in battles that saved democracy itself." Washington stepped forward. "Sir," he said to the bar manager who had emerged from the office, "I want to give you a chance to make this right. This Navy veteran was just insulted and humiliated by your bartender for no reason other than his age and appearance." The manager, seeing 6 SEALs and a tavern full of angry customers, immediately apologized to Frank. "Sir, your drinks are on the house for life, and you have my personal guarantee that this will never happen again." But Rodriguez wasn't finished. He turned to Davies, who was now visibly shaking. "Son, I want you to understand something. When you disrespect a veteran, you disrespect everyone who has ever served this country. This man earned the right to drink anywhere he wants, and he should never have to prove that to anyone." Thompson stepped forward with his phone. "Sir," he said to Frank, "would you be willing to take a photo with us? We'd like to post it to show the world what real naval brotherhood looks like." Frank nodded, unable to speak. The 6 SEALs arranged themselves around him, and several customers volunteered to take pictures. The images would later go viral, showing 6 elite warriors, honoring an elderly veteran, and demonstrating the bonds that connected all who had served. As the crowd began to settle, Rodriguez approached Frank one more time. "Sir, here's my contact information. If you ever face this kind of disrespect again, you call me. The Navy takes care of its own, and that includes sailors from every generation." One by one, the other SEALs offered their contact information to Frank. They made it clear that he had their support, and the support of the entire Navy community. "You're not alone in this," Wilson told Frank. "What happened here tonight was unacceptable, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." The video of the confrontation would be viewed over 12 million times in the first week alone. It sparked nationwide conversations about the treatment of elderly veterans and led to policy changes at bars and restaurants across the country. Davies was suspended pending investigation and ultimately chose to resign from his position. Sullivan's Tavern implemented new training programs to ensure all staff understood the importance of treating veterans with respect. Frank never paid for another drink at Sullivan's. The tavern declared him a VIP customer for life, and the 6 SEALs made sure to stop by whenever they were in port. His monthly visits became celebrations, with other patrons often approaching to thank him for his service. But perhaps most importantly, Frank never again felt alone or forgotten. The 6 SEALs had not only defended his honor but had welcomed him into their brotherhood. They visited him regularly, included him in Navy birthday celebrations, and made sure he knew that his service would never be forgotten. Months later, Frank would speak at naval events, sharing his story and inspiring younger sailors. The Tavern confrontation had made him famous, but more importantly, it had reminded the world that heroes come in all ages, and that respect for those who served should never depend on their appearance or circumstance. The 6 SEALs had taught everyone in Sullivan's Tavern a valuable lesson that night. Naval brotherhood transcends generations, and when one sailor is disrespected, the entire Navy feels it. They had shown that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about protecting those who have already given everything for their country. Frank O'Malley had helped win World War II 78 years earlier, contributing to a victory that preserved freedom for future generations. But on that Friday night at Sullivan's Tavern, 6 Navy SEALs had saved something equally important: his dignity, his honor, and his faith in the brotherhood that had sustained him through 8 decades of life. The tavern returned to its normal rhythm, but the lesson of that night echoed through the naval community for years to come. 6 SEALs had shown the world what naval brotherhood really meant, always faithful to the Navy, to each other, and to every sailor who had ever served, regardless of their age or the wars they'd fought. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with courage, conviction, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. On that night at Sullivan's Tavern, 6 SEALs fought and won a battle for respect, dignity, and the recognition that heroes deserve honor throughout their entire lives.